About a century ago, there were some people arguing that Paul was a Hellenistic Jew, unfamiliar with Jerusalem, didn't really know much about Jerusalem. Montefiore, who had a lot of good information, a lot of things suggested that, but he underestimates the Hellenization of Judea and Galilee, as a number of scholars have shown, starting with some Jewish scholars in the 1960s, and actually earlier. Saul Lieberman, though, in that period, other scholars, Cherikover and others, but especially established by Martin Hengel in the 1970s, that Hellenization had gone very far by the first century, and that was true in Judea and Lower Galilee, as well as many other places. Not to say it's the same as in the diaspora outside of Judea and Galilee, but there was a lot of Hellenization already there. So Paul could still be somebody who thrived in Judea, who thrived in Jerusalem. Also, Paul's own writings, Philippians 3:5, Paul tells us that he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. Well, when we read about Pharisees elsewhere in ancient literature, we read about them in Jerusalem. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews. So, same passage, Paul tells us that he had this kind of training. He also tells us that he had an advanced Jewish education in Galatians 1:13 and 14. He also tells us that he persecuted the church in Judea, Galatians 1:22 to 23. He didn't just come from the diaspora and just show up in Jerusalem to persecute the church in Judea without having another reason to be in Judea. He already had been in Judea before this happened. Another approach was to view Paul as a Palestinian Jew, as a number of people put it. A rabbinic Pharisaic portrait of Paul with W.D. Davies and others. W.D. Davies argued that Paul was a Messianic Pharisee, a Pharisee who believed that the Messiah had come. And E.P. Sanders, who was one of my own professors, one of my own mentors in my doctoral work, E.P. Sanders argues that, he has a book called Paul and Palestinian Judaism, and places Paul in that context. Now, even though that's Ed Sanders' expertise, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, or Jesus and Palestinian Judaism, he would not limit that to the full background of the New Testament. What he told me was, one time, originally when he started, what he wanted to do was do a comparison of Palestinian and Hellenistic Judaism, but life is only so long and he didn't get around to all of it. But he says, I really respect what Abraham al-Harbi has done with the Cynic epistles and so on. So these are not mutually exclusive options. Paul did have Hellenistic Jewish background. He also had Palestinian Jewish background. And also, something that prevailed out of the Yale School, I had E.P. Sanders at Duke, the cosmopolitan Greco-Roman background. That was argued earlier by Edwin Judge, who was a classicist teaching in Australia from New Zealand. I had the privilege of talking with him several years ago in Australia. And Abraham al-Harbi, who picked up some of that from him, and Wayne Meeks at Yale. There's also a widespread focus on rhetoric. For instance, Ronald Hawk, Ben Witherington, and others. And philosophy. For example, Troels Engberg Pedersen, who is a classicist who's a scholar of Stoic philosophy. Some have argued that nobody agrees with everything that everybody else says, but there's something that we can learn from many of these others. Also, Jeff Wyma, Stanley Porter on epistolary background, the way epistles were written back then. We can learn from many of these different scholars and many other scholars. The danger of me starting to list some is that I'm leaving out a lot of them, including some of my good friends, Linda Belleville and others. But Paul blends all of these backgrounds. All of these are part of his background. He uses what he has, which is considerable, to reach his culture, just like we should try to take into account the cultures that we're reaching, be culturally sensitive, without compromising at all God's true message that's been given to us in the Scriptures. Paul in the Torah, he was devoted to the Torah, to the law, before his calling. But he discovered that such zeal had led him not to God, but actually to rebel against what God was doing. I guess I can identify with this because I was an atheist before my conversion. And I was so arrogant about my intellect. And I eventually discovered that my intellect had led me just in exactly the wrong way. And I realized that the smartest thing in the world is to trust that God is infinitely smarter than we are. Doesn't mean I don't keep trying to figure things out. I do my best. Scripture says the hidden things belong to God, but it also says God hides things, but kings search out things. I'm not a king, but He's given us our intellects for a reason. We can search things. We're going to see a lot about the mind in Paul's letters Paul's letter to the Romans, and some of Paul's other letters too, Philippians, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, and so forth. But a mind informed by the Spirit, a mind that's led by God, is the mind that's going to go in the best way, because remember, as Proverbs says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge.